All right, so our species spotlight species of the day for this week is the cane toad, Bufo marinus. We've talked about this guy a little bit before in class. It's native to South and Central America, so the blue areas on the map. It was introduced to Australia as a biocontrol agent, so ideally to eat beetles and sugarcane. People had figured out they see this toad, it's eating some sugarcane beetles. We don't like sugarcane beetles. Let's bring it over and maybe it'll take care of our problem in Australia. Cane toad, one of the important things about it relative to its integration or lack thereof into Australian ecosystems is that it secretes a toxin, so a Bufo toxin, when it's threatened, and that makes it poisonous to most predators, and especially poisonous to predators that have not, in their evolutionary history, encountered the cane toad before. They're going to be naive to this Bufo toxin and therefore more susceptible to it. So what's interesting is the cane toad, when it was initially introduced, was introduced along the coast of Queensland and has since spread out into Australia. So the darker areas on this map are areas where the cane toad has been around for a longer period of time. And as you get lighter inland northward, you have more recent cane toad expansion into those areas. So this study, Phillips et al., what they looked at was the response of snakes that could potentially eat toads. You know, the toad looks delicious to this snake, except that because of the Bufo toxin, a snake that eats the toad is going to be poisoned because they have no evolutionary history with this toad. They don't know not to eat it based on their evolutionary history, and they haven't evolved any defenses against that poison. So here are a couple of Australian snakes. So in this Phillips paper, they looked at snake ecological and evolutionary response to the toad presence. And one of the things that was encouraging and pretty cool that they found was that both different species of snakes and snakes that had been exposed to the toad for longer time periods had different levels of resistance to the Bufo toxin. So on this graph, the snakes that had been exposed had lived in areas where the toad was introduced a long time ago. The snakes that had been more exposed to the toad had more resistance to the Bufo toxin, and more resistance is measured in terms of reduction in speed that snake can move when it is exposed to the toxin. Whereas snakes that were in areas that were where the toad has only been around for less than 10 or 20 years, they had a much larger reduction in speed when they were exposed to this toxin. So that's encouraging. It's showing that actually on pretty rapid timescales, these snakes are either they themselves are developing some resistance to the toxin, or the snakes that didn't have resistance to the toxin have rapidly died off and left those that are slightly more resistant. So a very big push on the evolutionary trajectory of these snake populations. The other thing that's really cool about this is that, so these are different genera of snakes in Australia. And the ones on the left side, if you look at the graphs on the right side of the slide, the snakes that are more towards the left, so the Pseudechis, the Dendrolaphus, and the Hemiaspis, those three genera of snakes are all less resistant, so they're more susceptible to the Bufo toxin. They eat a toad, they're likely going to die. The Tropidinophis, which is the one on the right, is more resistant for whatever reason to the Bufo toxin. So if that guy eats a toad, he's probably going to be all right. And there's a picture of him down in the lower left. So for whatever reason, that particular genus of snake is more resistant to the toad poison. So if you look at the Tropidinophis, location on both of these. So this is measuring change in the morphology of the snake, change in body size and change in head size. And you can see that the Tropidinophis point is pretty close to 0 in terms of both its change in body size and its change in head size. It eats a snake, or sorry, it eats a toad, it's going to be okay. So its morphology hasn't really changed during this time period. The guys on the left, though, that are more susceptible, less resistant to the toxin, they have changed their morphology. So their body size, if you look at the one on the top, their body size has actually increased slightly. So they have slightly larger bodies, but their head size has shrunk. So they have a shrunken head syndrome going on here, where their body size has gotten larger, their head size has gotten smaller. And why do you think that is? Because these guys are really susceptible to Bufo toxin. If they eat a toad, they're likely going to die. And so the snakes with the smaller heads, again, snakes are gape limited. Remember that word, right? They have to be able to, they can only eat what they can fit in their mouth. So if they get smaller heads and therefore smaller jaws and smaller mouths, then they're not able to fit that toad in their mouth. They're less likely to eat a toad and they're less likely to die. Pretty cool. I love this study. Such an interesting response of pretty rapid response of animal morphology because of an invasive species.